Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I've covered section 14.1 and 14.2, where we talked pretty much about what blood is. And just kind of a follow-up, about 55% of it is plasma, which is the liquid portion, and about 45% of it are the formed elements, which are basically the cells. So keep that in mind as we finish up the chapter. And today we're going to talk about plasma. You may hear people discussing plasma and serum. They are different. The plasma is all of the non-cellular portion of the blood. It's everything except the cells. Yeah, thank you. So that includes dissolved proteins called albumins, we're on section 14.3. Electrolytes, ions, various buffers, nutrients, hormones, and vitamins. The main function of the plasma is transport. It carries all of this stuff throughout the body, picks up waste products. We're not going to get hung up on what goes where and when and how. Just make sure that you know that it's transported. Everybody clear on that? We started section 14.3, plasma. Did everything go okay?
Yeah, they told me that they did.
Okay, so back to plasma. You will hear people in the medical profession talk about serum, blood serum. The only real difference between the two is that plasma is taken directly out of the bloodstream. Serum is coagulated first to remove fibrinogen. It removes the platelets and fibrinogen, which is a specific protein. Why would they do that? Does anybody have an idea? Seems like you'd want the clotting agents in, don't you? But the answer is, if they do some kind of transfusion, they don't want to make the patient have a further endangerment from blood clots. So when you get a transfusion, it may be whole blood, it may be plasma, or it may just be serum. In cases of a deep wound that has bled extensively, the main concern is blood volume. keeping the amount of liquid up. And in that case, they may just give you a simple saline IV just to keep the liquid volume up. You hear the phrase bleeding to death, but you don't actually die from blood loss. What you die from is organ failure caused by the circulatory system shutting down due to a lack of blood to circulate. It's called hypovolemic shock. Hypovolemic shock. I had a friend who was in the Army and served as a medic, and I asked him what the first thing he always did when one of the soldiers got shot or wounded. He said, first thing, I always hook him up with a saline IV. He said, that buys us time. So I think you guys see the difference here. Why do they use saline? Well, you remember I mentioned ions, didn't I? We know that pH of blood is slightly basic, so you want to maintain an isotonic gradient at 0. You want the isotonic conditions. Everybody knows the difference between hypertonic, and isotonic, right? You don't need me to go through that again. I'm getting blank looks. Do you all need me to go through that again? Yes or no?
Maybe a quick rundown.
Okay, quick rundown. Isotonic conditions mean that the concentration inside the cell equals the concentration outside the cell. They're equal. So in other words, if you're putting liquid in, that's going to change the salt balance, isn't it? So you want to put salt in rather than pure water. And that's why they do a saline solution. A hypotonic solution means that you actually have a lower concentration of salt and this drives water into the cell. It drives water into the cell. Is that going to be good for the cell? I'm sure we've all blown up a balloon, haven't we? There's a limit to how much the cells can absorb. And as you might guess, a hypertonic solution means you have a higher salt concentration outside the cell than inside. So what's water going to do in that case? It's going to go out of the cell and it will shrivel up, just like deflating a balloon. And don't feel bad if you need a little bit of a refresher. I always have to Google it myself to make sure I'm telling it right. I remember isotonic is equal, but I always get hypo and hyper mixed up. Is everybody with me? All right. So let's focus on the contents of plasma. The first one we're going to talk about specifics are plasma proteins. Plasma proteins. These are the most abundant of all the things dissolved in the plasma. And most of them are going to be one of three types: albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. And if you're wanting to know where we are, if you look at section 14.3, everybody see the heading that says plasma proteins. The albumins are the smallest of these and the most abundant. They make up about 60%. These are made in the liver. And essentially, they help regulate the flow of water between the blood and tissues. Thus, another way to state it, they help regulate the blood volume. If you get too much blood leaving, or too much water leaving the blood, it gets in the spaces between the cells and the tissues, and you get a condition called edema, E-D-E-M-A. Does anybody know what edema is? Swelling. And bottom line, that's their main function. They also bind and transport certain molecules. Fatty acids, hydrophobic hormones, things like that. Globulins make up about 36%. There are three classes of these: alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha and beta typically are involved in lipid and vitamin transport. Lipid and vitamin transport. Gamma globulins, you may have heard that phrase. Those are the antibodies. Those are the antibodies that circulate in your bloodstream. They're what give you immunity, both short and long term. Both short and long term.
So with like blood cancers, would that be what that affects, like the gamma globulins?
Blood cancer, we talked about last week. Did you listen to the online lecture?
Yeah.
It's called leukemia. Any blood cancer at all is leukemia. And essentially what that is, it's uncontrolled division in the bone marrow. The hematopoietic cells, those are the stem cells for the blood. And since most of the cells that have nuclei are white blood cells, it very often involves the immune system. Leukemia, about 50 years ago, was essentially a death sentence. I mean, there really is no good treatment for it because, by definition, even stage 1 leukemia is more or less metastatic. Because where do you find it? Everywhere. The standard treatment now is radiation to kill the hematopoietic cells in the bone marrow. Then they do a bone marrow transplant from someone who's a close relation, typically. Getting a perfect match from someone who's a stranger is very rare. And it's a very uncomfortable process. The testing, no big deal. They prick your finger, they got your blood. When we do lab, you guys will see me do that. I see a couple of you squirming, but
Yeah, don't they stick like a needle basically in your bone and
basically.
in the marrow and you just
And it's not a little needle either. It's one of those big
Yeah.
horse needles that But again, as I said, most of the donors are typically close relations. Like if my brother needed my bone marrow, I'd be first in line volunteering to say, take me, doc. Do what you gotta do. Because family's very important to me. There have been a few cases where essentially parents have had a child who develops leukemia. Nobody in the family is an appropriate donor. So they had an additional child solely and explicitly to serve as a donor.
Yeah, there's been a lot of legal cases about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, you can imagine the ethical dilemmas there. As I like to tell people, there's yet one more reason why I'm not a parent. But obviously, if you're a parent, hopefully you love your kids. And I'm fortunate I've got a good brother, but I don't know how I'd feel if I had a child or somebody that had it. It's a pretty rough road to hoe. But fortunately now, with that, the recovery rate for leukemia is very high. I don't know the exact number. If you want, I'll try to look it up later. But by definition, will that be interfering with the gamma globulins? Yes.
It's just more of like a down the road thing, like more of a going
Yeah.
that.
They've done some really interesting things with gamma globulins. Y'all have heard of Ebola?
Yeah.
Hemorrhagic fever viruses are a class of viruses that essentially cause the red blood cells to rupture. It causes more or less uncontrolled bleeding. And Ebola was essentially basically like a 75 to 80% death sentence if you got it. And they had an outbreak about 10, 12 years ago here in the US. Somebody had flown in from Africa and they had a cluster of it. I think it was in Texas, and one of the nurses treating this guy got it. And they actually gave her gamma globulins from his blood once he recovered. Essentially, they injected the antibodies directly into her bloodstream, and it saved her.
That's really cool.
The persistence of these things and the memory cells, we'll talk more about that when we get to the immune system. But I remember, I think I've told you all about the Spanish flu, 1918. Would y'all like to hear about it? It's relevant. Probably the single most deadly pandemic in human history. Y'all have heard of the Black Death. We talked about that, I think. The highest estimate I have ever heard for the Black Death was 50 million. 25 to 50 is the range. The lowest estimate, I've ever heard for the 1918 flu was 50. Most of the numbers go between 100 and 200 million dead. My grandmother would have been 11 years old. On the other side of the family, my grandfather's brother, who was a very young child, was exposed to it, and it affected him in his mental development. He was considered slow for the rest of his life, and he did not live a full lifespan. And the really interesting thing, most of the people who were killed by the flu were not people like me. They weren't the extremely old or the extremely young. They were people like you in the prime of life. The reason being, it caused a condition called a cytokine storm. Cytokines are molecules that the immune cells use to communicate with each other. And a cytokine storm means you release so much of them that your immune system goes completely haywire.
So you're basically like killing yourself off.
Yeah. That's an immune hyper response. Y'all have heard of anaphylactic shock. People who are allergic to things have to carry an EpiPen. But imagine getting that from the flu.
But why would that kill people in the prime of life instead of older people?
Who's got a more efficient immune system? Somebody in the prime or somebody who's immune compromised and elderly or not been exposed to a lot of stuff? Pretty wild. But what I was getting at, 1918, think of that. In the late 1990s, I read an actual paper where they had just published it. They had done a study on looking at the immune response to the 1918 flu. They had actually gone out into the Arctic. There was a village in Alaska that had essentially been wiped out completely by this. And they had buried all of the people who'd suffered in a mass grave in the permafrost. And they dug one of them up and they sampled her lung tissue, which was still preserved after all this time. And they found the virions of the virus in there. And they cultured them in the lab, and they wanted to see if, after 80 years, the immune system of elderly patients who had been exposed to it as children, if it would still work. It did. So when I say gamma globulins give you immunity, both short-term and long-term, I think 80 years is pretty dang long-term. You imagine being exposed to something 5 years old and still being immune to it at 85? And don't worry, the descendants of the 1918 flu, you've all been exposed to it. So if they sent you back in time, you all would have some partial immunity to it. There was a lot of people scared at the idea of them bringing this particular strain of influenza back. I read a couple of good medical thrillers on that.
Yeah, well, a lot of people thought they were bringing it back during, like, when COVID started happening. They thought it was back because it was like 100 years exactly, just about, when they started freaking out about it.
And, well, yeah, it was. They call it the Spanish flu because it actually probably started here in the U.S. Patient zero was a soldier being trained at Fort Riley, Kansas, because World War I was going on then. World War I actually overlapped with the first of the 2 or 3 waves of the pandemic. And the reason they call it the Spanish flu was because both the Central Powers, which were the enemy, and the Allied powers, which were us, were censoring their news. They didn't want it to get out. Well, Spain was neutral till the Spanish press started reporting on this illness, and they thought it originated there. Unlike the Black Death, it ended up affecting the whole world. The only place I ever heard of it not being affected was some island that was at the mouth of the Amazon River. It was the first truly worldwide pandemic. And I know, I'm sorry, I've gone way beyond what you asked about. That's a little bit further afield than blood cancer. But I hope you realize how important just the plasma is, because these gamma globulins really give you immunity. When COVID was going around, I managed to get in on the first round of vaccines, and I got the booster. And I ended up getting COVID 2 years later. But when I got it, it was no worse than a common cold. I went to the doc just to be certain, because at that point we still didn't know a lot about COVID and long COVID. And he said, well, why do you think it's COVID? Well, I told you about the game he and I played. Didn't I? I diagnose myself, and he'll tell me how close I am. So far, I'm batting about 50-50. I've killed myself about half the times with a misdiagnosis, which is why I was telling certain people in here, don't ask me too much for medical information. I know more than the average Joe, but that's still, I'm not a medical doctor. But the key, I had lost my sense of taste. couldn't taste anything. And that was a key symptom of COVID. And he actually brought in the blood test where I could see the reaction. It was pretty cool. He doesn't get talk shop a lot. So he told me he likes it when I come in because he gets talk shop. So everybody understand the role that it plays here? Hemoglobins. Fibrinogen. What is fibrinogen so important for? Blood coagulation. Anybody had a flat tire yet? A couple of you, 3 of you, yep. If you've ever had a flat tire, you know how much of a pain it can be, right? Well, I had a flat tire in my brand new vehicle about a year after I'd been driving it, and then I found out something that shocked me. They no longer put spare tires in brand new vehicles. Back when I first started driving, you not only had a spare tire, you had a full-size spare tire. By the time I graduated my PhD, they had gone down to those little donut tires, you know what I'm talking about, the little bicycle tire. They don't even have that now. They have a can of basically Fix-A-Flat. And Fix-A-Flat is a spray can that you hook up that's highly pressurized. It sprays this gunk in there, and it has a chemical that gums up the hole, which is exactly what happens with fibrinogen. It starts to break and come out of solution at the site of a wound. Then you get the thrombocytes. Remember the platelets we talked about, those little cellular fragments? They start getting caught up in that, and they break and release their chemicals. That signals more fibrinogen to come out of solution. And eventually, you've built up a fibrous plug that's catching red blood cells, white blood cells, broken down platelets, and just all kinds of junk, making a plug.
So people that suffer from like an abundance of like blood clots, that's what they're having issues with?
Probably so, almost certainly. If you get a mutation in the DNA of the gene, you get a change in the protein. So you get a change in the fibrinogen structure, it may just simply not be effective. That's kind of scary, isn't it? But having blood clots in your lungs or in your heart or in your brain causing strokes, pulmonary edema, or heart attacks is also not pleasant. Like just about everything in life, what keeps you alive may eventually kill you. Are you the only one in a happy mood today? You're the only one smiling. I know what's wrong with you. You're excused on that. Everybody else is just kind of, I tell you've been off a week. Okay, so everybody cool with the blood, the plasma proteins? Are you okay with it? You understand? You, yes you.
Yeah.
Okay. So next up, we have gases and nutrients. The most important ones, obviously, are oxygen and carbon dioxide. And I've mentioned the main carriers are not the plasma, but the red blood cells. How quickly does the oxygen bind to the hemoglobin? How well does it bind? I read a really interesting article this weekend. This is how much of a nerd I am. I was reading this last night, like 11 p.m. A couple of people out of the University of Zurich published a paper where they think that a mutation in hemoglobin is what killed off the Neanderthals. Neanderthal hemoglobin apparently was of a form that bound oxygen very tightly. In modern humans, it's much less tight. And they basically said that by us breeding with the Neanderthals, we introduced our version into them, and that made them weaker and they died. How wild is that?
Do you think it was because of like their harsher conditions?
I think it was a wide variety of things. And I also don't think we should call Neanderthals a separate species. Without getting into my area of expertise, which is taxonomy. And I'm saying that because, trust me, I could talk for the next 5 or 6 hours on this, which I'm not going to do. Bottom line, if you've got two separated populations that can't breed, that's called reproductive isolation. If they somehow come back together and they can breed, they're generally considered to be the same species. Does that help? I did it more in plants, which gives you some really interesting things, because you had the American chestnut, you had the Chinese chestnut. Those two are never going to come into contact, are they? Different sides of the planet. Humans, of course, being what we are, we bring everything everywhere with us, and believe it or not, they produce fertile hybrids. There's some people who say they are the same species, which is glossing it over, but hopefully that can give you an idea of why it's bad to just start labeling things. The American chestnut essentially has been wiped out by a blight that's native to Asia. But they have been back crossing them with the Chinese chestnut to try to get a strain that's like 15/16 American and 1/16 Chinese that's got the resistance but all the traits of the American chestnut. That's why I say don't get hung up on the whole Neanderthal thing. I just thought it was cool that they can look back at something that went extinct 40,000 years ago and say, yeah, we've got this figured out. And in case you're wondering, we all have Neanderthal DNA. Did you realize that? Basically, anybody who is not of pure African descent has at least 2% Neanderthal DNA on average. Okay, so other things that are gaseous. Nitrogen. Nitrogen doesn't play a biological role, but it does have an effect. Has anybody here ever gone scuba diving? Well, if you go, you have to watch very, very carefully for something called the BENS, B-E-N-D-S. You heard of that? You are breathing compressed air that has been pressurized at much higher than what the atmospheric pressure is. But you are down at the bottom of a 30 or 40-foot water column, and you have all that water pressing on you, so the outside pressure is much higher, isn't it? See where I'm going with this? So what it means is that gas dissolves in your blood. Once you leave the deep water and start coming up, the pressure in the bloodstream, keeping that, goes down. So that dissolved nitrogen starts to bubble. If you come up too quick and it bubbles too fast, you start getting those bubbles in your bloodstream and you get these really, really, really bad pains in your joints. And no, I don't know because I've never gone scuba diving and never intend to. But one time I went snorkeling. It took me about 30 minutes to get over hyperventilating when I had my face in the water. Even though I knew I could breathe, even though I know that tube is sticking out of the water far enough I'm not going to gag and breathe in water, I was still having my heart go boom, 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 until one of my students just capped my snorkel for a minute to keep me from hyperventilating, which was a bad move on both of our parts, but that was another story for another day. So it's not a transport, but it is something you have to watch. Let's see. Plasma nutrients. These are just organic or biomolecules that are dissolved in the blood. Simple sugars, as we're going to see when we get to the lab period. blood glucose. You've heard of that, I'm sure. And Caden will confirm, 2 hours ago, I took a massive dose of sugar. What was my blood sugar? Y'all want me to check it right now? Y'all want to see what it's done in 2 hours?
179.
And for those of you tuning in to the lecture online, I forgot to record a little brief part, so I asked people about nitrogenous non-protein substances. Any questions over all that? All right. 14.4, hemostasis. Hemo means blood, stasis means stop. Stoppage of bleeding. The first thing you're going to have is what's called a vascular spasm, whenever a small blood vessel gets cut or broken. And that's just a rapid contraction of the smooth muscle that's in the blood vessel wall. This is going to serve to constrict the blood vessel. If it's small enough, it may actually close the broken end entirely. Obviously, your pain receptors also let you know you've been hurt. The platelets sense this, they release serotonin, which further stimulates the vasoconstriction. And if I get going too fast, make sure you call me on it, okay? When this occurs, the platelets begin to stick to any rough surface. Generally, that will be the exposed collagen fibers from the tissues underlying the endothelial lining. A plasma protein called the von Willebrand factor gets released. And this enhances platelet binding. It enhances platelet binding, both to each other and to the damaged cell wall or blood vessel wall. Eventually, you get enough platelets there that they form a plug. This is not the same thing as coagulation. It's just the initial steps, the vascular spasm, followed by the platelet plug formation. After about 5 minutes, you're going to get a blood clot forming. 5 to 15 is what your book says. And you're going to get either extrinsic or intrinsic. Extrinsic is stimulated by chemicals the damaged tissue releases. Intrinsic is caused by contact with foreign surfaces. you're going to have a lot of biochemicals involved in this. Generically, they're called clotting factors. Clotting factors. Vitamin K helps regulate this. The main thing involved in clotting is the conversion of the soluble plasma protein fibrinogen into a non-soluble form called fibrin. Fibrin. These fibrin threads stick to the exposed surfaces and create a meshwork or net. A mesh or net. There are a lot of steps in this. If you're interested, figure 14.18 does a good job of summarizing that for you. You are not going to be held responsible for that. I just am referring it to you in case you're interested. While it is interesting, I think there are so many steps and feedbacks involved that I just think it's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. Everybody understands the concept. Vascular spasm, platelet plug, and then the clot itself. Everybody clear on that? And now we have a more or less permanent plug or patch. It will begin to shrink. This helps pull the edges of the broken blood vessel closer together. And it more or less squeezes out the serum from the clot, helping it dry. At this point, fibroblasts enter the blood clot and they begin to form fibrous connective tissue. Eventually, the clot gets dissolved. And the healing process has begun or is completed. A problem occurs if you get what's called a thrombus. Thrombus, Thrombus. This is either a clot or a fragment of a clot that dislodges. If the thrombus gets stuck, it causes an embolism. Embolism. Now, there are other things that can cause an embolism: an air bubble, a fat globule, essentially anything that blocks a blood vessel. If it blocks something in the heart or the brain, you have a problem. Heart attack or stroke. If you get it somewhere else like the lungs, it can also be fatal. A pulmonary embolism. Is everybody okay with that? Any questions? Okay, so blood types. They vary according to letter and RH factor. Essentially, the letter refers to the antigen that is present or absent. You have type A, type B, and type AB. All have at least one antigen. The AB has two. There's both the A and the B. People who lack the antigen, whether it's A, B, or both, make antibodies against the foreign antigens. So I am type O. Does that mean I have anti-A antibodies? Yes, because I don't have type A antigens. Does everybody see that? Do I have anti-B antibodies? Because they are foreign to me. Does everybody see that? So, if we injected someone else's blood into me, chances are very good that my immune cells will respond to that and view it as an invasion. Yes, sir.
So do animals have like the same antigen response or differentiating antigens in their blood
I
types?
have never looked that question up. Do animals have blood types? Yes, many animals have blood types determined by antigens on their red blood cells, but their systems differ from the human ABO system, with some having many more types. Dogs have over 13.
Oh,
So
Good question.
with O negative, you can donate to any blood type. So with O positive, can you get any blood types? Donate
No.
to?
I can donate to anybody. I am the universal donor. But I can only receive blood from other type O neg donors.
So what's the, with O positive, it's just like you just have a rare blood type, and that's just it?
O positive, you still have the Rh factor present. I don't, so my cells make anti-Rh antibodies. Yeah, my blood vessels or my blood cells are stealth mode. My antibodies are against everything. So I'm the universal donor. Type AB positive is called the universal acceptor. Because they don't make antibodies against anything, do they? They have all three antigens. Everybody see how it works? And now you see why the people in the Dracula van like me so much. And why I give, because someday I might need to receive. The main issue is when the foreign blood gets into the recipient's bloodstream. If the recipient has the anti-antigen antibodies present, they will attack the donated blood cells. Generally, this will start to form a clump that's called agglutination. Don't frown at me.
Well,
And this is why blood types and blood donations are so important. Are there any questions over how this works?
So, on table 14.15, if you can donate to anyone if you're an AB positive, why does it say that there's a preferred blood type? Is there like discrepancies between donating different types?
Well, take a look at table 14.14. Preferred and permissible. Is that the one you were referring to?
Yeah, yes.
You would prefer to get it from your own type, simply because it's going to be a closer match. If you are type AB and you get type B blood, you're not going to have the A antigen on the donated blood cells, are you?
Oh,
See, you want it to be as close a match as possible. In an emergency, can you take something different? Yes. If we were in a bad wreck and they take us all to the hospital and they need to give us each blood and they don't have our blood types and we're unconscious, they'll start by giving us all O neg. In my case, that would be a good thing, wouldn't it? Let's assume you had type AB, okay, just pretend. They give you type O neg, but then they blood type it to cross match it and realize you're AB positive. Then they stop giving you the OB neg and start giving you the AB positive because it's a better match.
so you're saying like I could, if they give me something different other than my type, that I could be like symptomatic?
I don't know exactly what it would do, but you want everything to always be as close a match as possible. The immune system is an amazing and wonderful thing, but it's also very tricky. Once my ex-wife started getting more than one autoimmune condition, she started collecting them like baseball cards. She had lupus for years, and that was it. Then she developed Sjogren's syndrome, lymphocytic colitis, celiac, a couple of others, and she was in bad shape there at the end. What triggered it? Who knows? Could have been stress, could have been age, could have been both. Could have been just because her immune system is hyper-responding. I told you about the Spanish flu, and that kills people. You just, anytime you have the immune system involved, you always want to be as careful as you can. And that's about the simplest way I can put it.
So is that why diseases like have an incubation period? Is that like a time whenever they basically scout out your immune system and find its weaknesses and then they come out and attack it?
Yeah, to a degree. It's not quite that simple. What you have to remember is the progress of an infection. The initial invasion comes at one point, right? But then you have proliferation, which means the invading cells have to grow. They have to keep reproducing. That is generally the incubation period is between exposure and symptoms when you first notice it. Now, it's been a while since I looked this up, but I read somewhere that on average, an adult human is successfully infected with a cold virus once a month. But you don't get cold symptoms once a month, do you? That's because your immune system clears the infection before it comes symptomatic. Does that make sense? So it's probably a combination of both. You got to remember, it's essentially a war. It's an evolutionary arms race.
Yeah. That's why you can never cure the common cold. There's just not a cure to it because it's constantly evolving, right?
Yeah. Plus, there is no such disease as the common cold. What we call a cold should better be called generic upper respiratory viral infection, because there's over 100 different types of viruses that cause the exact same symptoms. Does that help?
Yeah.
Why are you smiling?
I don't know, you started staring at me, so I got awkward. Yeah, you just started staring at me and I didn't know what to do, so I just smiled.
I'm staring at you because you were smiling, and I was wondering, why is she happy?
I'm sorry.
Most people about this time of day start getting grouchy. So, RH blood group, I think the case study went to enough exploration of that. Would you all agree?
Yeah.
We don't need me to go into further detail. The anti-ROGAM shots are pretty much standard today. They do that so you don't have any worries, whatever your blood type is. Any questions? All right, let's call it a lecture there.